Ms. Nurmi or Ms. Rara, would you like to comment on your thoughts on this?
Sure. The reason why the county executive doesn't support this is because it would be quite a few, we estimate quite a few polls would have to go through this conditional use. As a result, right now, we did meet with the hearing examiner, and we were trying to actually look at if we could potentially batch the uses and if we could find some savings there. It turned out there weren't that many savings according to what the hearing examiner estimated. So right now, as Mr. Zion said, it's approximately $16,400 for each conditional use. We would either have to somehow subsidize it through the general taxpayer, or if we were to lower that, or we would have to keep it relatively the same for each poll. And again, as everybody has said here, we can't estimate what that cost would be right now.
You know, there's...
Can I,
oh,
sorry,
no, go ahead.
just-
Go ahead, Nancy. Go ahead.
a rough guess, based on what industry has provided, a rough guess is that half of these would end up, over the next 3 years, half of them would end up in residential neighborhoods.
Okay. So,
And can I,
the number.
so I got stats from one provider. What they estimated is that they would have 100 in the first year, 200 in the second, 400 in the third year. That is based on that in the first area, roughly 40% of what they've got is at capacity, based on what they've told us that they are looking for in the commercial areas. I'm estimating that the first year, half of them are the other half where you're looking at are going to be residential areas. Over time, if you extrapolate that out, it won't play out in the first year. But given where we have if you look at a map and you look at the areas that are commercial, it's a relatively small land massive area. So that's how I got to 50%.
Okay.
But let me just sort of add also just on the fees right now. The FCC order stated that their presumption is that $100 is $500 for the first 5 applications, and $100 after that is what they set is the presumption of being reasonable. For these types of applications, at the Tower Committee, it's roughly $2,000 or $2,500. Zoning's probably $500 to $700. The OZA is another $16,400. For us to meet that, we could probably create a case in which we demonstrate that what we're getting in the neighborhood of a couple $1,000s covers our costs, considering all of the data and information that we provide. But it makes it harder for us to defend the additional $16,000. So to your point, if we said, yes, that we won't charge as much, that will streamline, that will have more people, but at the end of the day, someone's going to have to pay for that.
And that's a concern. And so I just put it out there. I'm not saying that we don't do this. I'm not saying it's the reason why we don't do this at this point. I'm just saying that it's a valid concern that we need to have, you know, and it's interesting. I just can't help but respond to what I hear in my ear as I'm trying to listen to you, and folks are saying, well, just streamline. No, it's coming from all sides, so it's fine. People are ginned up about this issue, and it's important. But streamlining. I remember when DPS went through a streamlining process and how incredibly difficult that was for DPS. I remember the launch. I came to the launch at your office and heard about how many man hours it took and how long it took for you to streamline some of your processes that still, from some people in the community, they still criticize as taking too long. I know you hear it. I know I hear it. And we made great progress. But still, again, it's not just that simple as saying, well, we just streamline the process. We just make it easier for folks. We just make it faster. I mean, there are things that have to happen in government to make sure that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. That is a part of our bureaucracy. If you could speak to that.
Yes, Mr. Rice. Actually, I think it's interesting you bring up the streamlining, and there were lots and lots of improvements. But recall that one of the major sort of, if you will, game changers in streamlining was the zoning rewrite. Mm-hmm. And the zoning rewrite, part of what made that the game changer was the fact that all of the levels of former special exceptions were moved to become limited uses so that the applicants would know what the criteria were up front that they would be able to adhere to, and they moved away from. The point of streamlining was to move away from the conditional use approach.
So in essence, Ms. Schwartz-Jones, if I can just summarize, what you're saying is we're moving backwards.
Well, I wouldn't call it streamlining, and I do think that, we had a table of 63 different items. It was cross-agency because recognizing that everybody has a piece of what happens, and the private sector does too, frankly. The quality of what is submitted has a great impact on the quality of what comes out. But limited use is certainly more streamlined than conditional use.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I'll have more comments later.
Thank you. I would like to just take a turn here. The issue is that the federal government has said you may not prohibit the service. So we're not able to grant residents the right to refuse to accept deployment in their neighborhoods or potentially even in front of their house. Given that, if you establish a process where people can, where we will pretend that they can have an impact, then at great expense, and then tell them, in most cases, I'm sorry, we have to approve this piece. And that's all we would do. That's all we would do. That's all this proposal would accomplish. That is why it is appropriate to make it a limited use. It is acceptable as a limited use. It is desirable as a limited use. We should establish clear, simple rules that facilitate deployment, that give us maximum distance without needlessly, trying to do something that we can't do, which is block deployment. We're not allowed to do that. And if the intent of a motion is to allow us to do that, we can't. And if the intent of the motion is to give residents a power that the Congress has already taken away from them, we can't do that either. So I just feel like this is truth in government here. We have to face up to what Congress has done, which is take away people's right to object and block deployment of networks, and do our job, which is create a clear, simple, transparent process to deploy infrastructure. Mr. Leventhal.
I appreciate the Council President's remarks, but I think the same thing could be stated about the unobjectionable Berliner Amendment, which we all agreed to, that would provide notice before any of these things were erected, because, and I asked about that, is what are you telling residents? That, something's going to appear in their neighborhood, but they don't have any ability to do anything about it. But we tried to clarify that they do have the ability to submit a statement to the Tower Committee, and that there would be some mechanism whereby residents could at least protest before what is probably inevitable does occur. And I do continue to believe that it is inevitable that 5G is going to be distributed throughout Montgomery County. The question that faces us now is how much time do we spend in court? How many times does the county council, the future county council, come back to this issue? And so my hope is that today we will go ahead and get that started, because the sooner that we get something out there, the sooner we begin to define what is a bridge too far, what the courts will accept, what it will not. I think, and I'm going to ask this question of my very good friend, we've been friends for many years, Mr. Hucker. If all your amendments pass, would you vote for zoning text amendment 1811? Yeah. See, this gets back to what I asked at our last meeting, which was, if Mr. Katz was going to motion to table, then why don't we just get that out of the way? Because we're going to spend a lot of time And the residents who are paying attention to this are very aggravated, and there isn't any measure that will be satisfactory to the constituent who wrote to me about 20 minutes ago saying, no to ZTA 1811, no 5G in our neighborhoods. Okay, we can't satisfy that constituent unless we just don't, but number one, we could vote down ZTA 1811, and my best guess is that's where the votes are at this moment. We can't stop 5G from going into neighborhoods, and people may believe that we can, but we can't. It is interesting that we had this discussion this morning, and we are lauding WMATA for having wireless in the tunnels and at the stations. And it's popular, and it's popular with me. I'm delighted when I ride Metro and I can read my email or catch up on the latest news in the Washington Post. So I do think that there's an overarching desire from consumers for faster access to more data, and that's going to carry the day. Whether it carries the day in 2019 or in 2022, none of us, or in 2025, none of us can say. But ultimately, this thing is coming. It's coming. And the industry is geared up. They're paying a lot of attention. If we pass something that is too restrictive, it'll be redefined and redetermined in court. And I'm prepared to, it's easy for me to say, I'm not on the ballot in November, to get something going that we can deal with in court. But the amount of time that we're spending figuring out how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, if there aren't 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 council members willing to vote for ZTA 1811 as amended, I don't think is the best use of anybody's time. But I don't know that we can, suss that out at this moment, so we can continue to go over the fine points on this. I am concerned about the cost. I mean, I am concerned that the entire public would bear the cost of staffing up OZA and staffing up DPS and staffing up park and planning for a process that won't actually empower people very much, and that ultimately will lead to industry, which we can't impose the costs on, even though we should, getting what it wants. That's a real legitimate concern that the sponsor of the amendment ought to think about. Well, no, not even if we win in court. I mean, what Mr. Rice's point is on point, that a conditional use is going to cost money, and we can't impose those costs on industry. And so all taxpayers are going to bear that cost for opening up to a very few residents who will object. Another thing that comes to mind here, I'm making parallels, but they're relevant, is the accessory apartment issue. There were a lot of objections from the civic community, and we liberalized accessory apartments, but only so far. And it turned out that people just shrugged. It was like, okay, there's going to be an accessory apartment. There were very few objections heard, and so we liberalized it yet further. And that may occur here as well. The reason that the proposal was for conditional use only for where there wasn't already a pole in the ground, let's face it, is that it's highly likely that if you've already, for most people, not the ones who are emailing us, not the ones who are active, but for most constituents, it's highly likely that if you've already got a pole on your street and then there's some new thing on the pole on your street, most people will shrug their shoulders, and they're much more engaged in downloading data. There's a whole lot more people who are going to be downloading fast, large quantities of data than there are who are going to be objecting to these poles on their street. I don't minimize the seriousness and the legitimacy of the feelings of those who are writing to us. We all take them very seriously. We wish we could be responsive to them, but as the Council President said, the federal government has said we can't. So we cannot do what the emails are asking, not all the emails, but many of the emails are saying, keep 5G out of my neighborhood. We literally cannot do that. And therefore, I do think that most of these amendments, everything's well-meaning, we're all motivated by good intent, but they're not going to satisfy the loudest voices here, because the only thing that would satisfy the loudest voices here would be no 5G, and we can't say no 5G. And if we did say no 5G, a much larger number of constituents say, what are you talking about? I want 5G. I just saw the ad on TV about how great it is, and I want to be able to download all this data really fast. So we face a dilemma. Having said that, I'm going to restate what I said 2 weeks ago. I think it is appropriate and good public policy to put something out there, and then it'll likely be tested in the courts. I think that we ought to take seriously the amendments. I would encourage my colleagues as best as possible. If you're not going to vote for ZTA 1811 anyway, then maybe we shouldn't take up a whole lot more time with a whole lot of amendments if your intent is to vote it down. Every council member obviously will do what in he or she's best judgment is, but you know, if we're going to get some vehicle out there to be tested in the court, which I'm amenable to doing, then you know, maybe we could just not spin our wheels on things if the ultimate end is that the ZTA isn't going to pass anyway. I also would request, could we have a division on these issues? Because I think the retaining the 60-foot setback, but allowing a nearer setback to avoid a denial of service claim, I think that's less controversial, so maybe that could pass quickly. On the issue of if everything's going to be a conditional use, I would ask, is there any way, and I'm actually directing this question to Jeff Zients, could we make the same condition, and would that be acceptable to the sponsor? In other words, every tower in a residential zone would be a conditional use unless it would create a denial of service claim. Would that be acceptable to the sponsor?
I mean, the only way you could determine that is to be into the conditional use process itself, so I'm not sure exactly what that's saying.
You wouldn't know until you had the application reviewed. There's a presumption or no?
Well, but we're imposing conditions for limited use, and we can only go so far on limited use.
Well, what
The
exactly what
comment was,
condition you
how
would
would you know
oppose?
until you got into the conditional use? That was,
Before us, which is Tom.
yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, did we agree on we start at 60 and then we go to 40 and then we go to 30? Is that what's before us now? Well, it's a yes or no question. Is that what's before us now? Was that amendment accepted by the sponsor?
So if you forgive
Yeah.
me, Mr. Hucker and I have had a number of conversations,
Yeah.
and we sort of agree that the 40 going down to 30 is sort of inelegant, and Mr. Hucker's okay just at 30. And
Okay,
so-
great. So could I request a division, and could we pass what we can pass and minimize, start making some progress here? So I'm requesting a division of the two bullets in the middle of Mr. Hucker's memo, and could we just pass the second bullet now, retain the 60-foot setback, because that's not controversial? Could the council agree to that? Do the second bullet first. That's not controversial.
Okay, so the second bullet is to retain the 60-foot setback standard, but allow 30 feet if necessary to avoid it. That's a limited, that's
It's only under conditional use.
only under conditional.
All right.
have to-
So,
you have to do the
so you have to do the first one to create the conditional use.
do the first one and get the second.
Well, well, that's what Mr. Berliner was going to offer. Right.
Under the auspices of limited use.
All right, I'll yield for now.
All right. On the amendment that is before us, which has been accepted as a friendly, 60 to, well, it's both all limited, all antennas are limited use, are conditional use, and it's 60 to 30. Mr. Katz.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. First off, and I know that we're only speaking to this one amendment, and I have many other to discuss, but to George's point, I am going to vote against this entire legislative piece of legislation. I don't believe that we can amend it to the place where it should be at this point. Having said that, to this amendment, I support this amendment, but I believe that in the beginning, Mr. President, you said that we're suggesting a prohibition of service is what we're discussing, and I don't believe we're discussing that at all. I believe that we know that there has to be service. I believe that the FCC, though they are not Congress, though they act like they are, that they have said that we cannot prohibit service, and we are not prohibiting service. What we are saying is that the service itself should be the best that it can be for all involved. And I don't believe this legislation at this point does that. But I also don't understand, candidly, that if we have the prohibition, if something, we go down to 30 feet, and what happens if the service is not going to work at 30 feet. Does that mean that it goes to 20? Are we prohibiting service? How does that work?
No, it would be a denial on our part, and then we would, if in fact there's a wide area that's, doesn't get the new service, it may be taken to court.
So if we're suggesting to I guess to the council president's thought that if this is just something that you know, if someone comes in and you really can't deny their service, why are we even saying 30? I believe we should say 30. I believe we should say 40. But
Well, I think there's a high likelihood with 30 feet that we would not be denying service.
okay. And to the point for this whole discussion, it's my understanding, and Mr. Zients, please correct me when I'm wrong. It's never if I'm wrong, it's when I'm wrong. But it's my understanding that the FCC is the one that has said that you have to allow all new technology, and if you don't, that's considered a prohibition of service.
It is the new FCC definition of what is a denial of service. Under the Fourth Circuit, it would have only been if there were gaps in service. Under the Ninth Circuit, it was whether you were denying enhanced service. And of course, the FCC liked the Ninth Circuit better than the Fourth Circuit. So their new order would say enhancing service is also a denial of service.
But at this point, I'm asking, I don't know the answer to this. At this point, the courts have said that if you have service, whether it's 4G or whether it's 5G, that's still considered service and that you're not denying it? Is that correct?
In the Fourth Circuit, that's what they've said, yes. In other
Which is their
circuits, they've
circuit.
said no.
Yeah. Well, and the other side of this, and we are going to have to get back into the other part of this discussion, the FCC's order does not go into effect, I believe, until January 13th, 2019,
That's
which is a
correct.
Sunday.
That's
And
correct.
so, right now, the FCC order is not in effect yet anyhow. Is that correct?
That's correct.
To me, to Councilmember Leventhal's point, I'm going to vote against this. I think that we need to figure out a better way to do this than what we're suggesting. And as far as I'm concerned, the amendments make it more palatable, but they certainly don't make it tasty. And because of that, I think that we should have a discussion whether or not any of this is going to go forward.
Mr. Elrich?
I think you very eloquently stated the problem here. You can, and I do agree with your general approach. If this were to get 5 votes, I would prefer to have the best bad bill, and rather than a bill that has even more flaws than an amended bill would have. I don't think. I mean, there are some issues like the Tower Committee and other stuff that just have not flat out been addressed yet. And, you know, it's not like you all are surprised, because that was one of the things I said I really wanted was a full addressing of everything before we did a bill, and you all didn't bother to do that. So there may be an amendment on the Tower bill or future action, but there's nothing now. And I thought there was plenty of time to have addressed that issue in the past. So I have those reservations. But I have other concerns. I mean, when we're talking about denial of service, so by what right do we tell people you have to underground utilities?
By what right?
Yeah, when you have all these neighborhoods that have underground utilities, you don't see cable wires going into their house, their cables come underground. How do we do that?
I'm not certain. I think that was a local law that we required underground utilities. Do you know, Bob?
We locally lawed a neighborhood and said you have to underground?
No, that is when you're doing a new development.
Okay,
We
right.
required undergrounding.
How did we do that?
I think,
Can we, Mark,
Why is this utility different than all other utilities? I mean,
because it's wireless.
that's a question you can answer.
Well, because it requires antennas that need to be above ground.
But couldn't a supplier of the people who put the fiber in a neighborhood say, you know, I don't want to go through the expense now of undergrounding the utility in the house and let me put a tower up and run a wire in?
Well, the way this service works is it's an antenna that goes to some other mobile device or some stationary device, and then it goes directly into cable. So there's both an antenna and cable with this.
So I would just tell you that if I can bring fiber to the tower outside, to the pole outside the house, I could bring the fiber to the wall of the house or inside the house and connect it to a transmitter inside the house. So they get the glorious 5G, but they get it in the house, but it's just another 30 feet of cable. So why is that a crime if we were to say you can only do this inside the house?
I mean, I mow my lawn now and then, and I have a cell phone in my pocket, and that's not connected to a cable.
So, okay, I mean, I'm not finished yet. Everybody else is, look, I know it's
We have
late.
it on the amendment.
But
Mark, it's
on-
on the amendment.
We have more to talk about. It's just the amendment.
I'm not the only one who's strayed from this amendment. I won't stray much farther, but look, I think this amendment is better than what the bill is. I will probably do what Sidney said, support every decent amendment we can get out of it, vote against it and see where the chips are. Unless somebody wants to call a question and see where the votes are now. But until then, I'll continue amending away.
This amendment has a kind of a consequence for subsequent amendments. So I think what we'll do is we should vote on this amendment, and then we will break for lunch, and we will assess how much more there is to talk about. So, continuing on this amendment, Mr. Berliner.
So I just want to share again why I do think this amendment is appropriate. And I say this with the greatest respect to our council and to those who have worked so hard on this. There is a price to be paid for moving forward in the way in which our county seeks to move forward. And that is due process. And due process does not come cheaply. So isn't it extravagance to allow people to protest something which in all likelihood will happen? Yep, it is an extravagance. Do I think it's a necessary extravagance? I do. And so that's been my experience on this council for 12 years, that if we want to move forward, then there's a certain price we have to pay to move forward. And I do think, as Mr. Leventhal said, and as Mr. Reamer, the council president, has said, this is going to happen. This is happening. And we can't stop it. But we can go the extra mile to let people feel that they have a voice, even if it is a small voice, even if it necessarily does not change the outcome. It is the price to pay for progress, to make sure that people feel like they are respected and heard. And it doesn't come cheap. I get it. But I believe in it, and I believe that this is the way we ought to go.
Mr. Hucker?
It's their conversation.
Well said. It's like following Abe Lincoln here. Just to respond quickly to Councilmember Leventhal's assertion about the cost, the FCC specifically said new costs can be imposed where they're reasonable and as a result of the application. In paragraph 77 of the small cell order, it says the cost must be 1, a reasonable approximation of cost, 2, the costs themselves are reasonable, 3, they're non-discriminatory.
So does that cover $13,500 for the cost of the hearing examiner's time? Would that be included in that?
Joy, Mitzi?
I just want to point out that while we're discussing all the federal law and the FCC orders, I think that the scarier prospect of state preemption, which is absolutely sitting out there, and there is no law that says the state can't preempt us. They absolutely can. And I think that so that while we're sitting here debating the intricacies of the FCC orders and the federal law, I think we're going to have to pay the piper at the state.
Okay.
That's
That's opening
But
up a bigger topic.
Okay, on the
shouldn't-
FCC order,
We don't need to.
what I would also point you to are paragraphs 56 and 57 of that order, in which the FCC, in looking at the case law and the decisions that they like, stated the commission concluded that state or local government requirements such as fees that impose a quote financial burden unquote on providers can be effectively prohibitive. That's paragraph 57. At paragraph 56, they state that by contrast, fees that are based on unreasonable cost, such as exorbitant consultant fees or the like, go beyond government recovery of fundamental costs of entry. In the notice requirement that the amendment, the Berliner Amendment that was put in there, that is not intended to be a nothing burger. The point of that is that the Tower Committee right now has a history that they ask providers, was there another location that you could pick for co-location? They look at those factors. The idea behind that was that a person in that neighborhood would see that something was coming, they would have the ability to submit something in writing, and the Tower Committee would actually take that into consideration. You can weed out things that you can't consider, but I will tell you that in conversations that we have had with residents, there are about 20% of the time somebody brings up something because they're in a specific neighborhood. And that was our attempt to create a process,
Right.
to give due process, so that people would actually have say. But it gave us a balance because we would like to do that within the Tower Committee without having to have the additional fees for conditional use. And those would be most limited to the poles where they're already over 22 feet. So where you've got a utility pole and you're kind of asking, well, which utility pole am I going to go on, is a different question than which 14-foot pole would I replace and have the least visual impact. It also means that where you're using a pole that's on a larger, wider road that you could use, where they may already have other equipment, we looked at places where could you place this equipment where there's already a crosswalk sign. So essentially the box could just be, the crosswalk sign could be there and you wouldn't notice it as much. So I just want to clarify that the reason why the county executive supported that notice requirement and the industry supported that notice requirement, because it was the intent to create a process that was similar, that was not financially burdensome, and I think it's very defensible in that sense that it's not that much you're going to go out to the poll anyway and you've got to do other things to put a sign up on it. That was our way so that we could try to equalize that, but streamline the process, as Diane mentioned, so that we reserve the conditional use and the cost for that, whoever pays, the cost for that is in the cases where we need it most. And in the other areas, how do we get resident input in a way that's within the law that we can process within the shot clock?
Exactly. And that's the limited use framework. Mr. Leventhal?
Yep. So again, I'm going to restate. My hope is, may not happen, that we report out some version of ZTA 1811 with amendments, because the sooner we get this process started, in my judgment, the better for the county. This will be determined in court. The parameters of what we can and cannot do, I'm sure, will be determined in court. Residents will sue, or industry will sue, or whatever, but feelings are so high on this that we would be best served to get this started. And so I'm willing to support this amendment from Mr. Hucker. I hope that in the future, the council will look at the issue of fees, and that'll be debated in court too. Every single item of this is going to be contentious. Industry wants no limits, no costs, untrammeled access. Industry is greatly exaggerating the number of towers that they need, that they absolutely have to have. The parameters will be set ultimately through, a combination of regulation and legislation and technology. And none of us know today, and industry doesn't know either, how many of these towers they really need or how widely spaced they really have to be. So in the hope that voting for this amendment by Mr. Hucker gets us closer to reporting this out and letting this tortuous process get started, because the sooner the better, I'll vote for this amendment from Mr. Hucker. I do want to address the point that Ms. Nurmi raised. I think that the worst outcome from the standpoint of state preemption is ZTA 1811 as amended is defeated by the county council, because that would show that in the largest county in the state, 9 full-time council members, we've been talking about this for years, we just can't handle it. We don't have the capability. We're too nervous, we're too, and I wouldn't say too, we're extremely responsive to the constituents who contact us, and we just can't act. We don't have the capability to act. And in that case, I think if I were a state legislator, I might say, okay, local government's so close to the people, can't handle the opposition, state government needs to act. I think if we adopt something, it makes it somewhat less likely that we get preempted by the state, because the FCC, let's face it, not responsive to folks who live in Travilla or Silver Spring or Clarksburg. They don't care, okay? County council members, extremely responsive, extremely easy to reach, extremely accessible through telephone visits, social media, stop me in the supermarket. You know, we're really right close to our constituents. State legislators also. You know, the delegates, the senators, even from more conservative counties, they also get stopped in the supermarket. If this issue becomes a hot topic for residents, it's not only going to be a hot topic in Montgomery County, it's already a hot topic in Anne Arundel County, it's going to be a hot topic in Howard County, the Eastern Shore. So I'm not so sure that if we pass something plausible that the legislature actually is going to override us. If we do nothing at all, and we're all just speculating here, we're all just using our best political instincts, but if we do nothing, if we can't pass anything, then actually there'd be a justification for the state to act, because local government would prove that we're not competent to handle this task. So I'll vote for the first Hucker Amendment, and I just would love to expedite this if there's any way to do that.
All right, I think we've had plenty of discussion. I do not support the amendment myself. I think that it is totally unrealistic and unnecessary, and we'll see how things go. So let's have Mr. Rice?
Thank you. Just quickly on the issue of state preemption. Spent a lot of time in Annapolis. The state has the authority to preempt us whether or not we pass a bill. We have an argument that they should grandfather us in if we pass something. I understand that argument, but they have the authority to preempt us one way or the other. 2, no other county in Maryland is rushing to do this the way we're doing it on this timeline, but they're all under the same federal and state requirements. The questions at hand are, when could the Assembly meet to preempt us? The Assembly, well, this is October. The Assembly doesn't meet till January. They don't pass bills till February. Bills don't go into, they don't have effective dates before July 1st or October 1st. So there are months before a state law goes into effect. Specifically, what happened to the bill last year that was introduced to preempt local legislation on this topic? Senate Bill 1188. 1, it had no co-sponsors. 2, it was scheduled for a hearing, and then the hearing was canceled. And 3, the sponsor lost his election. So I wouldn't look at that and say that bill is ready to pass. Right now, it lacks even a sponsor. And third, when I've spoken to numerous members of the mighty and largest Montgomery delegation, staff, experts for the PSC, staff for the relevant committees, they think it's not months, it's years before legislation like this passes in Annapolis, despite what the industry wants to pass. Because to imagine a majority Democratic House and Senate passing a bill this controversial, preempting 24 counties, including that are mostly Republican, and imposing their will when the bill looks very close to an ALEC model bill, I don't see that bill sailing through the Maryland General Assembly, given my experience there. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Rice?
Very quickly, look, I hope to be back next year, and I'm very concerned about the fiscal implications that this amendment brings about. I think it's very serious and one that we need to consider. It's the reason why I reached out to Planning Board and to DPS and asked the question I did, because we're going to have to battle between funding a lot of things, and I was very upset with how our budget process went this year in terms of things that I felt we should have funded and couldn't fund. We're talking about millions of dollars, folks. We're not talking about just a couple $100,000. And so that has significant impacts on our ability to be able to fund things that we care about and we know that we need to do in the community. So there are real consequences as a result of this, beyond just what's here in terms of, and I do believe in a process. I just want to say, I would have supported Councilmember Berliner's amendments, and I'd already told him that, and he knows that. So for those who asked to work with us, I was working with you, and I was already there when it came to his, and was supportive of Mr. Katz's amendments with some tweaking to them. So I'm there when it comes to amending this bill to make it better for the community. But I do feel as though we do need to consider the fiscal implications that this amendment has, and we have not done that yet.
Mr. Eldridge?
Also quickly, I feel like we're being unfairly put under a shot clock. And I think Tom's point about the state legislature is actually probably a good point about the state legislature. I would rather have some of these issues resolved that are in court, some of them, which would at least give us a clear notion of what the playing field is going to look like. What I don't want to do is shoot ourselves in the foot, because it'll even be harder to walk ourselves back if we discover they don't go as far as everybody's afraid of. And, you know, possibly if we get a Democratic half of the Congress, I'll try to be as optimistic as I can, some of this stuff may actually get somewhat stymied in the national arena. So I do think, I agree with George, there is going to be 5G. People are going to want it. I think the council did the right thing in putting it where it put it. So nobody can say we didn't enable the growth of it. We enabled the growth of it in the most important places. But if people haven't read the articles, even put out by the industry, about how this is supposed to unveil, almost every company is talking about even a more intense deployment of 4G, because 4G has a wider band and they can serve more people with far fewer towers. And they're talking about a density of uses driving the need for 5G, which is why some of the cities, which the industry likes, have parked 5G like we did all around their commercial areas. They made sure that if you're a business center or a commercial center, you can have all the 5G you want. But you'll find the same cities with maps of residential areas where you see almost no towers, because they made a decision that they don't have the density of use there to justify this. And this is where I think we've kind of leapt from a defensible position in the bill we passed before to what I think is a more questionable decision now. So I'd like to wait, but I do understand we are going to have to do something.
All right, it's time to vote, folks. Florine, Ms. Florine?
So I think it was 2 years ago, wasn't it, Jeff? We started this odyssey, right? And then we were told, oh no, the county executive's going to fix it. So we pulled it back. We'd started the community conversations. We pulled it back. We turned to the county executive. County executive brought forward the one bill that we've all agreed to with respect to the commercial areas, and we passed it. The community thought, oh, great, we're off the hook. So then the end of July, we get the next drop, which has everybody all up in arms. You know, ordinarily, the way we would handle this is we'd have a public hearing, listen to everybody. We've had committee meetings. We'd listen to folks. We'd work more with the community, and we would take our time in resolving such a thing that has, now there are signs up in my neighborhood with very anxious people who obviously, I don't think, understand what's going on, are confused, and are scared. Why are we doing this? We're doing this because of the magical day, I guess it's October 31st. It's always a magical day. Halloween, because that's when we have to act. Well, I think this is just plain wrong. It's wrong to everybody. I agree that we should take more time on this based on these exchanges that we've had. And then to say we're going to do something to avoid preemption, or we're looking forward to the preemption debate, or let's bring the litigation on. Is that responsible? I don't think so. As it is, folks are loading on things they're not going to support at the end in terms of this legislation. You're adding costly processes. You're telling the community they're going to have a voice when, in fact, they will not. This is becoming something of a charade. So I think, I'd say let's let the next council take care of it at this point. These add-ons are not solving the problem. And I think it's raising expectations that there's a community engagement effect that isn't going to happen. This whole idea of how we're going to figure out who's going to be the expert to determine denial of service, that's going to be fun. I look forward to the math, and they're certainly not going to be able to do that within the shot clock requirements. So I don't know what we're proving at this point of the game. I don't support these changes.
Mr. Leventhal?
I think it is responsible to enact something now. I think the sooner this gets tested, the sooner we find out what court challenges are out there, if any are out there. Maybe they aren't out there. Maybe maybe we've exercised our local prerogative and we are deferred to. But I do think it is responsible to pass a ZTA now. And I'm frankly less concerned. It's not that I'm not at all concerned. But as I said before, I'm open to amendments so that we can get something out of here. Whoever is the next county executive, this is going to be on his or her plate. And if anybody thinks that we won't have precisely the same emails from precisely the same constituents and deal with precisely the same disputes about is it 30 or is it 40 or is it, was it now we're talking about 60 or is it 300? Precisely, the issues are pretty clear what they are. I want it far away from my house. That's not going to get any better on the next council. It's not going to be any different on the next council. It's just going to take longer. And it would suggest, as I said earlier, and I'm making the point twice, to quote Craig Rice, because I think it's important, it would suggest that we can't handle this, that we aren't able to do this, and that therefore some other level of government will step in and do it for us. And so I think we should move this, and let's bring up the amendments and vote them up or vote them down. But I would really, I don't think there's any benefit whatsoever for us or for the next council or for the community or for the council after that to say, we can't handle this, let the next council handle it. It's much more likely that we can handle it than that the next council can handle it, because you've got all this time it's going to take the new members to get up to speed on these issues. This is as complex as any issue I've dealt with in 16 years in this body.
All right, time to vote.
Just so I know what
Yeah,
you're
we need to
voting on.
clarify the motion.
As I understand it, you're voting on the first bullet in Mr. Hucker's amendment that deletes limited use added by 1811, and that the second proposal is now the same as what the Fed committee recommended, so that it requires no change. Is that correct? The 60 to 30 is still...
Well, it was all together.
Okay, you're
But
not
it's
taking
already-
it up. You're taking it up when you consider conditional uses later on. All right, so it's just bullet one. Okay.
So
Just bullet
just
one
in
and
the,
two.
in the Hucker packet, it's at line 36 to 40. That is the deletion of the limited use.
It's not, it's more complicated than that. It's a whole amendment. You have to go through the land use table. It's attached to his whole memo. So, right, bullet one. Got it. Okay.
30 substitute.
All in favor, raise your hands. All opposed? And the motion carries 6-3. And we will break for lunch. And we have a public hearing at 1:30. We have about 20 witnesses, I think, for the afternoon public hearings. And then we have the climate emergency report after that. So we will see if we can,
Can we bring that up after lunch?
just one, consult with my colleagues here for a moment.